And speaking of necessities, the finances of the individual household, a lot of folks these days sense that the official systems of finance, ever since the 2008 collapse, they realize it's a house of cards, and it's ready to fall down and take them with it. And could you speak a little bit about the truth versus deception of what people are being told and what they're not being told about the stability or threats of our existing financial system?
Well, it's been a house of cards for far longer than just back to 2008, because what happened is about 100 years ago, a corrupted Congress and a corrupted president sold this nation back into the slavery of the exact same system of banking we fought a revolution to be free of, which is that the only currency that you could use had to be banknotes borrowed at interest from that central bank. And that is a system that's been in existence for 300 years, and it is deliberately designed to transfer the wealth from the people whose labor creates that wealth to the bankers. And it's just this complete fraud and hoax, and yet they have acquired so much wealth and power by this scam that they're able to start wars against anybody who refuses to go along with it. If you go to whatreallyhappened.com, up at the very top, right underneath my picture, you'll see a link for an article called "All Wars Are Bankers' Wars," and this article has gone viral all over the globe. Somebody's made a video out of my radio presentation of it, and apparently there's another one that's getting ready. But this really basically tells the history of the United States primarily from the point of view of this war between banking systems. When you hear the phrase clash of civilizations in the media, what they're really talking about is a war between banking systems, between private central banks that issue all the public currency as a loan at interest versus the kind of economy the nation was started with, which is where the government issues the currency, it circulates through commerce without accruing any interest, and is taxed back at the same amount at the end of the cycle to balance the books and close out that fiscal period. And that is a system that allows people to transform their labor into decent standards of living. But the private central banks are basically legalized counterfeiting operations. They're creating the money out of thin air. They lend it to people at interest, and then by the time it comes back to them, there's interest owed on it. That money doesn't actually exist. And so somebody has to borrow even more money from the central bank just to pay the interest, and the cycle just keeps going forward. It is, by any reasonable definition of it, a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme, but because it sits astride the entire nation, it has managed to survive for 100 years. Obviously, it's now nearing collapse. Every one of these nations with a private central bank is drowning in hopelessly unpayable debt, and that is part of what people really need to keep in mind. Every time you're holding a piece of paper with colored ink all over it, called a Federal Reserve note, you are holding the proceed of a loan that is accruing interest as it passes from hand to hand to hand to hand, from the original borrower to the worker to the grocery store to the delivery man to the gas station and back. It's building interest to that private central bank, even though it's nothing more than ink and paper. But you're not allowed to create your own ink and paper with which to pay that back to the bank. And by design, these private central banks, and that's the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, by design, the system will always produce more debt than money with which to pay that debt. So the debt is always going to be going up. And there's a horrible result of all of this. You'll start issuing this money. Everybody's encouraged to borrow until they reach a point where they can't borrow anymore because they're struggling with the accumulating debt. And it's at that point the Keynesian economists say government must borrow on their behalf, and I might add without their permission, to keep the system going. Then you reach a point, which is where the United States is right now, where the people won't borrow anymore and the government can't borrow anymore, and it's at that point the bankers will kick off a war, a major war, because wars force everybody to borrow more to fight the war, and then to borrow even more afterwards to rebuild from the war. And when it's all over, ordinary people like you and I, we have pretty much what we had before, except the graveyards are a lot bigger, and we're back into debt to the bankers for another century. And this is by design. These bankers make money off of both sides in a war. They don't care who wins or loses because both sides are driven into debt to those bankers. And it's just a way to translate the blood of our children into gold in their pocket, and they are perfectly happy with that system.
Speaking of the Matrix and alternate realities, when we visited the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C., we looked down from the catwalk above through the glass windows over the printing press room, and one of the workers down there holding one of the huge sheets of $100 bills, is $3,200 all in one sheet, held it up to herself and mouthed up to us, "All for me," and then she just waved her hand away dismissively and put it on the stack with all the others. It was a huge stack. It was feet thick. But the tour guide pointed out that, "Folks," she says, "this looks like money right now, but it's just ink and paper when it leaves here. We send it over to our customer, the Federal Reserve across town, and it's they who monetize it, and then it becomes really money." And we went over to the Federal Reserve, and they weren't giving any public tours, and then the guards ushered us out when we tried to go in. But the mystery and the mystique behind how suddenly, what obviously to everyone's eyes, the emperor has no clothes on, as we were all looking at, seeing this is just ink and paper, but suddenly it turns into money magically over at the Federal Reserve due to some mysterious phenomenon that nobody understands.
Now, Dunnigan, aren't you a little old to be believing in magic? If you go back to the original laws of the United States of America, the actual money, the unit of value, was silver and gold. The original paper money in the United States was not considered money. It was a claim check, and it had stamped on the front of it that you could take it into a bank and exchange it for the silver and gold, which was the lawful money. And those paper claim checks, that's all they really were. And they were issued simply because it was much more convenient to be carrying around the paper than sacks of gold and silver. When the Federal Reserve came in, that all went away. They just waved their little magic wand, and they told the American people, well, see, it looks exactly the same as those old pieces of paper. There's George Washington and everything. But that piece of paper is not redeemable in gold or silver. In fact, the only thing that backs up the U.S. Federal Reserve note is American slave labor. Because if you think about it, the Treasury Department issues a Treasury bond to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then issues the paper currency in an equivalent amount. The only way that that Treasury bond can be redeemed is somewhere down the road. The government has to take tax money away from the American people without giving them anything back for it. And that is slavery. And that's how these Treasury bonds are being redeemed. And it is a system of slavery. It's ruled by banker debt. And it's no more legitimate a form of governance than rule by divine right or rule by chattel ownership of your person, meaning slavery. And it works only because, like those earlier systems, the people have been brainwashed into believing that this is the way life is supposed to be, and we should never, ever, ever, ever even consider that there's a better way to do this.
Yeah, and it also says backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States, and that leads the discussion of confidence and how this is a confidence game. Could you talk a little bit about the truth gap around the people's confidence in the real economy, what jobs and unemployment are really doing, what inflation is being told to be, what it really is, and where the gaps are there and how people can be aware of that?
Well, we already know that there's a credible amount of fraud on Wall Street. It's never prosecuted. Following the 2008 meltdown, the U.S. government took trillions of dollars away from the American people to give to the bankers to loan back to the people at interest. Iceland threw their bankers in prison, which was a much better solution, and they're doing quite a bit better. The loss of faith in the dollar actually goes back to the Nixon administration, because the reason the dollar is the global trade and reserve currency goes all the way back to World War II. And Roosevelt's price to Churchill for bringing the United States into the war against Nazi Germany was that Great Britain would surrender the pound sterling's role as the then global trade and reserve currency and allow the dollar to take over. So at the end of World War II, all of the world's financial powers met at a luxury resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, and they hammered out the Bretton Woods Agreement. And the Bretton Woods Agreement said everybody has to see the dollar as the universal currency, and you have to accept it at its face value, tie your currencies to it. And the rest of the nations went along with it on two conditions. One, that the Federal Reserve not overprint dollars to simply loot real products and agriculture from the rest of the world for the cost of ink and paper. And second, that the U.S. dollar would always be tied to gold at a price of $35 per ounce. And on those two conditions, everybody signed on, and the dollar became the global trade and reserve currency. Well, the Federal Reserve is not actually a part of the federal government. They're a private company. They're no more federal than Federal Express. And so, of course, they immediately did start overprinting dollars. And a large part of the prosperity that America saw in the 1950s and 1960s came from the fact that the Federal Reserve was just printing up this money out of thin air, sending it to other countries and saying, send us grapes, send us wine, send us cheese, send us cars, send us whatever, and made out like bandits. Well, then you got to 1970, and the government of France was looking in their vaults, and they saw this huge stack of ink and paper. And they notified the U.S. government that they were going to exercise their option under Bretton Woods to convert it back to gold at the price of $35 per ounce. Nixon took a quick look inside Fort Knox, realized that the U.S. did not have anywhere near enough gold to cover all that ink and paper, and he ended gold convertibility. And that was really the point at which the rest of the world began to wonder about the full faith and credit of the United States government. And even worse, it created an instant collateralization problem for the U.S. government because they were still, even back then, borrowing money left and right from everybody to sustain the military, to sustain their growth. And these other countries began to say, well, if you don't really have the gold that we thought you had, we can't loan you money without some collateral. So Nixon pulled a fast one. He created the Environmental Protection Agency officially to take care of our natural lands, and they began a program of public land confiscation and sequestration. And it was hidden under a wide variety of program names: wilderness zones, roadless areas, heritage rivers, wetlands. But to date, they have grabbed almost 25% of America's public lands and locked them away from the American people. And that land is what's pledged as collateral on the government borrowing that the U.S. has been doing from other countries and other investors since the 1970s. And all of this is illegal because in the Constitution, it says that the U.S. government is not allowed to own any land other than what is underneath their federal buildings and military bases and public works like harbors. And that's also a big part of this whole land grab thing out in Nevada with Clive and Bundy. The government is clearly outside the Constitution, and that's what makes it illegal and illegitimate.
Speaking of selling off, just basically carving out the heart of our homeland itself and selling it off to foreign interests. We've been hearing about China as the largest single holders, foreign holders of American debt, having fists full of cash, being able to buy out assets, real estate, etc. I know Hawaii, where you live, is a prime target for that. But we've been hearing stories of that all over. The railroads that roll through our neck of the woods, all our Canadian Pacific railroads, the docks where we have commerce being loaded, unloaded, or being sold to China, and so on. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of this, basically selling the very body of the country as the last thing you can sell before you're done?
Yeah, well, we have a coffee cup we sell in our online store that says the last official act of any government is to loot the nation. Again, going back to Nixon ending gold convertibility, obviously demand for the dollar as a global currency fell at that point, and so the U.S. embarked on a new policy called the petrodollar. And what it was is they went to all the Middle Eastern oil nations and said, we will protect you militarily as long as you agree to sell your oil only for the U.S. dollar and invest it in the United States. And that was called the petrodollar. And that meant now that countries had to come to the United States and either borrow at interest or trade products for ink and paper tickets with which to get their oil from the Middle East. And the U.S. financial center was getting a piece of the action off of other people's products. And our financial structure became very lazy. They had all this wealth coming in from the petrodollar deal, just like they'd had the earlier wealth coming in from Bretton Woods. And because of this, they said, well, we're getting rich. We don't need to get our hands dirty with manufacturing. And over the last going on 40 years, American manufacturing has declined. We no longer produce the top quality products in the world. American products are seen as overpriced junk. And more recently, this disastrous experiment with GMO has destroyed about 85% of America's agricultural exports. Monsanto may be screaming that we Americans are going to eat their product, but the rest of the world is saying absolutely not. It's become a major stumbling block in the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so that's one of the reasons they've embarked on this war agenda, because without that mafia-like piece of the action of other people's commerce by getting a piece of oil sales and also other raw materials, the U.S. economy is going to implode. And so this whole war agenda that we have seen going back to 2003 is all about conquering any nation with natural resources to make sure they are sold only for the U.S. dollar in order to keep the scam going. And I'll give you two examples. Back in 2002, Saddam Hussein got permission from the United Nations to start selling Iraq's oil for the euro. 1 year later, the United States screams he's got nuclear weapons. They invade Iraq. They lynch Saddam Hussein, and Iraq's oil is back on the world market, but only for the U.S. dollar. Then you have Muammar Gaddafi, who was doing really good things in Libya, major aqueduct infrastructure projects. He was turning Libya green, and he was everybody's friend, reformed terrorist, and then all of a sudden he announces we're going to close down the private central bank that Libya has and replace it with a state central bank. There's going to be a new currency, the gold dinar, based on value, government issued, not borrowed at interest, and this was the final straw, Gaddafi announced that Libya's oil was for sale on the world market, but only for the gold dinar. So they invade Libya, they kill Gaddafi. The gold that was going to go in the gold dinar has vanished, much like Ukraine's gold has. They've got they're back on a private central bank, and Libya's oil is for sale in the world market, but only for the U.S. dollar.
Now, you mentioned confiscation of various things. In terms of direct confiscation of people's financial accounts, that sort of thing, could you touch base on real and present danger to people's savings, checking, IRAs, 401ks? If people believe those are things that they own, what do they need to be aware of?
Well, they need to be aware that if their money is in somebody else's bank, computer system, stock market, it is vulnerable. As Europe has sunk into the inevitable depression brought about by the European Central Bank, we've already seen in Cyprus where they had what they called the haircut, or the scalping, depending upon your point of view. And we know that this recently concluded G20, one of the things they did agree on was that they would all universally redefine a bank savings account holder as an unsecured investor in the bank, meaning if the bank gets into trouble, your savings accounts are not going to be made good on. And they're already talking about bail-ins, where if the bank gets into trouble, well, you're going to have to share the losses because you're not really the holder of a savings account. You're an investor in the bank, and the losses can be transferred onto you. And by the way, any system which transfers the losses onto the people while preserving the wealth of the ultra-rich, that's not capitalism anymore. That is fascism. And we have definitely crossed that line.
Well, we've painted a pretty bleak picture, but I think it's one that is eye-opening and sobering, and the tagline of our channel is to be helping you to be aware and prepared. So we've worked on the awareness side about it. What can we do to help people be more prepared? Can we focus in on maybe the top three things that people can do to take responsibility for their information and awareness? I think you started that out in the beginning as far as media and education, and also their property and their finances.
Well, our advice to our readers and listeners at this point is that you should really have no more money in the bank than you need to cover your immediate obligations so that your checks don't bounce. And you should have the rest under your own control at home, some as cash, some as physical silver and gold. Do not get suckered into a gold futures contract. Those things are leveraged something like 100 to 1, and they're already having to scramble to cover the existing contracts, which is why so much of other people's gold seems to have vanished from the New York Federal Reserve. And as much as possible, delink from the government. Just go on your own way and don't deal with the government unless you absolutely have to. Don't give them permission over your life. As far as protecting your data, for those of you who really do have something worth protecting, you should never be on the cloud. The cloud is just compromised. What the cloud is all about is trying to take computing back to the model of the 1970s of giant mainframe systems, and your electronic devices are just data terminals into that giant mainframe. And it certainly makes your data accessible to anybody who's at that mainframe, makes it easier for the government to spy on you. If you have secrets that you need to keep them on your own flash drive. You need to air gap your computer. And if you have the programming skills, if you go and look up my NSA challenge, the code examples are in there that you can copy and modify and change and write some encryption systems that are pretty much unbreakable.
Well, Mike, you've been very generous with your advice and insights. Is there anything before we let you go that you'd want to leave with our listeners as far as how they can be aware and prepared about the truth gap, about the real threats that are out there versus what they're being told in the official sources?
Well, the best advice is for everybody to trust their own intellect, their own analytical capabilities first and foremost. Don't take anybody's word for anything, including mine. Get the facts and make up your own mind. And that is the first step to regaining our independence.
Thank you very much, Mike Rivero from WhatReallyHappened.com. Appreciate you being here on Reluctant Preppers.
I had a lot of fun. Thank you.